Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our very last episode of our spooky webinars, our webinar series this month with our Division of Parks and Watercraft. I'm Alyssa Gapel, and I have today with me some friends that are going to be helping out. First, I have Lauren Broderick, or Lauren Stewart now, recently married. And Lauren's going to be helping me with the Q&A. So if you have any questions for our presenters today, please utilize the Q&A box and we will make sure, we'll do our best to get your questions answered. I also have with me Sarah Stankovic. Sarah's actually with the Division of Wildlife. She's a wildlife technician, but a huge fan of bats and an expert. So we invited her today to help us out. And lastly, we have naturalist Catherine Connor from Houston Woods State Park. And Catherine is going to be kicking us off today as we celebrate Bat Week. So I will hand it off to you, Catherine, to get started, and we'll hear from Sarah in just a little bit. And all right, your presentation is coming live now, Catherine.
Thank you, Alyssa. All right, everybody, welcome to Bat Week. Bat Week is a wonderful celebration we not only do here in Ohio, but is an international celebration. It is annually October 24th through October 31st, and this gives everybody a chance to really celebrate these wonderful little creatures and really highlight the role that they take not only in nature, but also how they help us in our economy, and everything as a whole. So I'm really excited today to share with you a little bit about Ohio's only flying mammal. A little introduction first is, like Alyssa said, my name is Catherine Connor. I am a naturalist here at Houston Woods State Park. And Houston Woods State Park, a lot of people think of us as being the place with birds. We've got a beautiful array of educational raptors here. Anywhere from our bald eagle there in the middle, we've got hawks, owls, falcons, vultures, but we also specialize in a couple other things. We really love getting out into the park and our community and doing some service projects. So we do a lot of litter pickups, we do a lot of plantings, we do a lot of raising of some insects to get them out and healthy into the environment, well, to be food for some of our bats sometimes. But one of my favorite parts of my job, yes, it's wonderful working with animals, it's great working with the community, but it's the people in our division that I get to meet that really make the difference sometimes. And a couple years ago, I had the pleasure of getting introduced to Sarah from the Division of Wildlife. And I would love for her to get to introduce herself to you today.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Sarah Stankovic. I've been with the Division of Wildlife for about just a little over 2 years now, but I've been involved in and out of the bat world for probably the last 7 to 10 years. So my main role at the division right now is to organize and carry out a lot of the division's bat research. So I'm really excited to share some of that information with you guys today. But first, we want to just talk about some bats in general. So Catherine, if you can give me the next slide, please. Yeah, you can go ahead and skip to next. There you go. So I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of background about bat bodies and morphology of bats. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, bats are the only true flying mammal. So there are flying squirrels, but they don't actually fly, they just glide. So bats are the only mammal that is capable of real true flight. And the way that they do that is with their specialized wings. So bats are in the order, it's called Chiroptera, and that literally means hand wing. So you can see from this image in the center here and then down on the lower left that bat wings are actually really similar to our hands. So they do have a thumb, and then they've got the same 4 fingers that we do. They're just really elongated, and then stretched between that those fingers is just a membrane that serves as their wing. If you want to know what a bat wing feels like, the best thing to do is to close your eye and just feel your eyelid. That's really similar to what a bat wing feels like. So bat wings are different from bird wings. Birds also have the same 5 fingers that we do, but they're actually fused and form more like 3 fingers. And then of course birds have feathers and bats have that wing membrane. And then the last thing I want to talk about on this slide here is bat feet. And I'm sure most of us know that bats hang upside down, or at least most of them hang upside down. And so you might be wondering, why do they do that, and how are they able to do that all the time? So first, Catherine's going to show you some other bats in the next slide here, but despite some of the bats being really large, they actually don't weigh that much. So even the largest bats only weigh about 2.5 pounds. So when they're hanging upside down, gravity doesn't have the same effect on them as it does us. So if we hung upside down, the blood would pool in our heads, we'd get really dizzy. We wouldn't be able to do that for very long, but it doesn't work that way with bats just because they're so light. And then what about getting tired? So if we were hanging onto something, especially by our feet, all day, we would get really tired. But if you think about making a fist, when we make a fist, it takes us energy to contract our muscles to make that fist. But for bats, it's the opposite. They have specialized tendons so that their feet are kind of always curled. And when they hang upside down, the body weight activates those tendons and it keeps them hanging upside down without expending any energy. So it really takes zero effort for them to hang upside down. It doesn't make them tired. They actually have to expend energy to open their feet. And so the last question is, well, why in the heck would they choose to spend all this time hanging upside down? So basically, the way that bat bodies are structured, they're not like birds. They can't run and take off from the ground, or they can't just sit in one space and take off from the ground. They need to drop down. So if they're hanging upside down, all they have to do is just let go, and then they can immediately go into flight a lot easier than if they were sitting on the ground. So that's just a few basic characteristics that most bats have in common, but bats across the world are incredibly diverse, and so Catherine is going to go ahead and tell you about bat diversity.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So going on with the diversity in bats. So we think of bats right now as being in Ohio, and they are, but they are also worldwide. There are over 1,200 or around 1,250 different species of bats. And the species of bats can really be broken down into microbats and megabats. And as megabats sounds, they are a little bit larger. Microbats are going to be kind of bats that we're more similar and kind of used to thinking in our minds. Those are going to be species that we do have here in Ohio. But the thing about all of these different bats is just that they're all different bats. Bats can be different sizes, different shapes, have different, shaped ears and eyes, noses. And like Sarah was kind of pointing out with the way the body of a bat is designed, there's a lot of similarities between bats and other mammals, including ourselves. So a lot of times people try to separate themselves from animals. Think about this. They also have the ears. Those ears can help them, hear their young, hear different calls, their eyes. That is a very common misconception that bats are blind. You can see from these images right here that bats do have eyes. They typically don't see the same colors that we do. It's often kind of thought that they might see more black and white tones, but they do have eyes. Especially, you got to think not all bats are going to use echolocation. Some bats are going to just use their nose and their eyesight to find some of the fruit. So our fruit-eating bats are a really good example of that. But then remember, they have a nose, they've got a mouth, and we'll talk a little bit later about that echolocation I just mentioned, which the nose and mouth help out with quite a bit. I did want to point out here, though, that bats, like I said, not only shapes, but also sizes are different. The largest bat in the entire world is going to be a golden-crowned flying fox bat. And it blew my mind when I found out that this bat is exactly the same wingspan length as I am. I am 5 feet 6 inches tall, so is that bat's wingspan. That is amazing. But also, some people might get scared of thinking of a bat being that large. That is actually a fruit-eating bat. It's one of those megabats I mentioned before. That means that they are going to munch on bananas and all sorts of other good things like that. And then, on the other hand, we've got the world's smallest bat, which is the Kitty's hog-nosed bat, kind of nicknamed the bumblebee bat. And that bat is so small, it has a wingspan of about 5 to 6 inches itself, but then it weighs only 2 grams, which is going to be about the equivalent of maybe 2 Skittles. So a very, very small bat. Now, our bats here in Ohio are just a little bit larger than that. And why don't we talk about what kind of species that you might see here in Ohio? So in Ohio, we have about 10 different,
Sorry, I wanted to ask one question since you talked about eyesight before we moved on, because we did have a question about eyesight.
Absolutely.
Derek had asked, do bats have night vision?
Okay, so Derek, that is a wonderful question. So a bat's eyes are adjusted to see a little bit better at night. Most mammals actually have specialized vision to help them see at night a lot better than our eyes do. If you do remember, though, that their vision is going to be a little bit more heightened at night, but they can't see in pitch black. And we'll talk about later why that echolocation is so important to them, because they are hunting at night. Thank you, Derek, for your question. Back to our Ohio bats and what you might get the chance to get to see here. I mentioned we have 10 different species of bats. Those 10 species of bats, those microbats, so smaller insect-eating potentially bats, are going to be broken down into two sections. They're going to be broken down into bats that we can see and that will stay here all year round, so our cave hibernating bats. But then what I want to talk about first is our migratory tree-dwelling bats. Now, these are going to be bats that a lot of people don't think of bats as being migratory, but they're going to leave either to find a warmer location or to find a separate location out of Ohio to hibernate in themselves. So our migratory tree-dwelling bats are going to be these four right here. So we're going to talk about first, up in the top left-hand corner, the evening bat. The evening bat gets its name because it's in its own kind of separate genus from the other bats, and that is going to be the Nycticeus genus. And what that genus actually means or says is belongs to the night. So evening bat belongs to the night. The look of this bat is going to be a lot like a big brown bat that we'll show here in a minute. And then it's just a little bit smaller than that big brown bat. So size comes into this. And then I learned something new yesterday. I love learning new things. But evening bats and a big brown bat, if you had them side by side, say you're a researcher and you're trying to figure out which one is which, you can just give them a sniff. I found out that evening bats actually have a little bit of an odor to them that kind of smells like burnt orange, I am been told. I have never sniffed bats personally, but Sarah told me all about it. I loved that fact. So evening bats, a little bit smaller than big brown bats, but similar in look. Our bottom one right there is a hoary bat. Now, hoary just means a grayish white. And you can see right there, they've got this beautiful fur that goes all along their body. And it's going to have kind of that whitish tip to the end, so having that hoary name. That is going to be the largest bat that we have here in Ohio. And I say largest, it is only having a wingspan of about 12 to 13 inches. So it's still not anything like that mega bat. Up in the top right-hand corner is going to be an eastern red bat. Now, eastern red bats are the only bat that we have here in Ohio that have two different colors. And what that different color means is if it's a girl, a female, or a male. So females tend to be a little bit lighter in color, and then a male tends to be darker in color. And then lastly of our migratory tree-dwelling bats is our silver-haired. And as that name suggests, they've got some silver hair. Silver-haired bats do have that black fur and frosted tips, just like that hoary bat did. But what's kind of neat about silver-haired bats is because they are a migratory species and along with their size, they tend to be very slow flying bats. And they're slow because their wings are designed more for flying long distances than short distances. So that's something, if you were to see them out at night, you might be able to pick up on a little bit. So like I mentioned, these bats are going to go ahead and leave when it's starting kind of like right now. So this is perfect topic for fall. Our bats are getting ready to leave, whether that's going to be migrating out of Ohio or going ahead and getting into their area for hibernation. That brings us to our cave hibernating bats. We have 6 species that are going to hibernate in caves or mines or areas like that. And starting up in our left-hand corner is going to be a little brown bat. Now, little brown bats have a sleek, kind of glossy look to their fur. It is a dark, kind of light brownish color, but then their underbelly is always going to be a little bit lighter. And something to kind of point out with them is on their little muzzle, so on their nose area, it does have fur over it, whereas with our big brown bat, which is right underneath, does not have any fur on that muzzle. It's also going to have that light to dark brown fur, paler underneath, but distinguishing the little brown bat and the big brown bat is going to be your size. The big brown bat, as suggested, is a little bit bigger. Up on top in the middle is going to be our tricolored bat. That is a very small bat. It's actually the smallest bat in the Midwest, so smallest bat we have here in Ohio. And even though I'm saying small, we're still thinking about an 8 to 10 inch wingspan on that bat. So still a little bit of a bigger bat. Nothing like that kitty hog-nosed bat in the beginning. But this tricolored bat has 3 different color bands on it. It's got pointier ears, and then it does have, as this photo kind of highlights pretty well, has a more pinkish arm than some of our other bats. The next bat below that is going to be our Indiana bat. This Indiana bat is a little bit more of a dull color, kind of like a dull gray. And then on top, our small-footed bat is going to be a smaller bat. It's going to be brownish. What's really kind of catching about them, not only their small foot, we'll get to that in a minute, but is their face. They've almost got a black mask on, and that's something kind of unique and kind of, you can identify them that way. And then, as the name says, small-footed bat, they do have pretty small feet. Only about 6 to 8 millimeters is the size of their foot. And then we've got last, our northern long-eared bat. Now the northern long-eared bat looks a lot like the little brown bat, except giant ears there. Those nice long ears really come in handy when they're trying to do a lot of different things. But they are going to be a medium size, so they are a little bit bigger than that little brown bat. And you might have noticed, especially because I have them written in red for you, so maybe it's a little more eye-catching. Northern long-eared bat is federally threatened. The Indiana bat is federally endangered, so that's our entire country. And then here in Ohio, we've got the little brown bat, the tricolored bat, Indiana bat, and northern long-eared bat are all state endangered. Now, all 10 species that I mentioned are state listed in some way, meaning that they are at least a species of concern. So it is illegal to either harm, harass, kill, or anything like that to a bat. And why all of these animals are on a species of concern, threatened, endangered, we're going to talk a little bit more in the PowerPoint about. With these cave hibernating bats, though, they are going to, this time of year, as it's starting to get colder, they're going to start migrating or moving towards our caves. And Sarah is going to tell us a little bit about what it means to hibernate.
Thanks, Catherine. So we generally consider August 15th to kind of be the cutoff date for when we're doing bat surveys. So after August 15th, we consider that to be the migratory period. So even those bats that are not moving long distances, they're going to have a summer area and then a winter area. So after August 15th, and especially around this time of year, they'll be starting, well, they'll probably already be at their winter grounds. They might be not necessarily in the cave yet, but at least in that area. And so technically, bats enter what's called a state of torpor rather than true hibernation, but just for the sake of being simple and clear today, I'm just going to call that hibernation throughout the presentation. So Catherine, if you can switch to the next slide. Thank you. So bats can't survive in the trees during the winter because it's too cold, so they're going to move to other places to hibernate, and we'll call that a hibernaculum if it's one, or hibernacula for plural. So traditionally we think about caves as being a bat hibernacula, but there's other types as well. They can spend the winter in places like mines, which is this picture on the upper right is a mine that has actually a bat gate on it to allow the bats to get in and out, but to keep people from getting in and out. And we've actually found a lot of bats, particularly big brown bats, that are hibernating actually above ground in these unique kind of honeycomb rock structures. So this is just sandstone that's been weathered in a certain way to create all of these crevices, and the bats will sometimes just climb right up in there and hibernate inside those rocks. So what happens during hibernation is that a bat's heart rate is normally around 200 to 300 beats per minute, but during hibernation it's going to slow down dramatically to just about 10 to 20 beats. And then their body temperature is going to drop. Depending on what environment they're in, it could be close to freezing. We found some bats at around 35 degrees Fahrenheit when they're hibernating. So their body temperature drops dramatically. They might take a breath only every few minutes. So basically their systems are all slowing down, and that reduces their energy costs by about 98%. And this allows them to spend the winter when there's no food for them to eat, just kind of living off of their fat reserves that they've built up over the summer and fall. So there's some groups of bats that hibernate in really large clusters. This photo on the left is a group of Indiana bats. They're one of the ones that typically hibernate in these really big groups. There are other bats that are more solitary hibernators, like the tricolored bat. You will find different species of bats sharing the same hibernacula. Sometimes there might be some little browns mixed in with Indianas, but for the most part, they're going to stay grouped in different species. And Catherine, you can switch me the next slide, please. And you guys have probably heard about this, but unfortunately, our cave hibernating bats have become susceptible to a disease known as white nose syndrome. This is caused by a fungus that we think has been introduced to the United States and North America from Europe. So what happens is that this fungus likes to live in cold areas. So it'll live in those caves and mines and places where the bats are hibernating. And again, because their body temperature drops so low, that fungus can then actually grow on the bats. So in this photo here, you can see the white fuzz on the muzzle, on the ear tips, on the wings, basically anywhere that there's bare skin on that bat, this fungus can grow. And what the mechanisms of what it does are kind of complex, but essentially what it boils down to is that it increases the immune response of these bats. It makes them wake up a lot during the winter. And again, they're surviving off of this fat that they've stored up because there is no food for them during the winter. So they're burning through that fat reserve much earlier than they should be because they're waking up when they should be hibernating. And essentially it just leads to them dying from starvation or dehydration. So unfortunately, we found this fungus in Ohio in the winter of 2011 and 2012. And at this point, we do think it is probably everywhere in the state, and we act like it is everywhere in the state. Some of our hibernaculum have experienced 95 to 99% mortality. So it's just absolutely decimating bat populations across Canada and US. And that's directly responsible for some of our species that Catherine mentioned being added to the state endangered list this past July. So the little brown, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolored bat are being hit especially hard by white nose syndrome. So the bats that do make it through the winter, they're going to emerge from the hibernaculum in the spring. So usually starting around the beginning of April, and they're going to be really hungry because again, they burn through all that energy. And so Catherine's going to talk about the diet of bats in Ohio, what they're eating and how they're doing it.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, that white nose syndrome I had learned about, but it was actually learning from a presentation that you had given about how detrimental it really was to our Ohio bats. And that is why it is so important to learn and appreciate our bats. So let's talk about the diet that they eat and a little bit about what we can do to help our bats. So what a bat in Ohio, those 10 species, they're going to go ahead and be insectivores. There are, like I mentioned before, some bats that do eat fruit. There are some blood-drinking bats. Those are not species that you find in the United States. They're more of a South American species. And even those species are not going to go after human blood. So that's another myth we want to debunk here. Those animals are going to go after sometimes birds or other small mammals. So humans do not have to worry. So like I mentioned, though, our 10 species are going to be insectivores. This means that they're going to eat very small insects. You'll notice this guy's got a grasshopper there. Moths are great food for them. And one of my least favorites, mosquitoes. That's why we need these bats. It was found that a bat in 1 hour could eat up to 600 mosquitoes. I imagine if we didn't have bats, it would just not be good. What I did find with our insectivores, though, is how they get their food. So not only echolocation, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but how they actually use their body to get their food. So once they get to that food, what they're going to do is they're going to use their hands. They're going to use those hands a lot like, almost like a racket. Basically, they're going to smack that food, whether they are bringing that food up to their mouth or what they can do is they can hit it down, catch it with that tail, and put it right up to their mouth to eat. They're going to be eating in flight. They're not going to stop usually. So they can eat in flight. And then the other thing, and we'll talk a little bit further about this later, is they also drink water in flight. So they are going to find unobstructed ponds, lakes, things like that, and just glide over for a quick drink. For us, though, let's talk about that echolocation, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to understand because we don't do it and we can't hear it. So for echolocation, what it is it's going to be this very high frequency sound that a bat's going to produce either from their mouth or their nose or sometimes both, but they're going to emit this sound into the air. So as they're flying, they let out this sound and they're waiting until it hits something. So say, like in this picture shown, it hits a moth. So that sonar hits that insect, and then it basically echoes back these vibrations and things for our bat to interpret. And so once they've interpreted that insect is around, they're going to get closer and closer, and they're going to go ahead and emit more and more of these sound waves. And what it does is it kind of helps them figure out exactly where it is. So yes, bats here in Ohio have eyes and they can see, but a lot of times they're eating when it's pitch black out, so they really do rely on this echolocation to help them find and approach foods, as well as, not only approach food and other objects, but kind of steer clear of some things if there's something flying in their way as well. So with that echolocation, though, I mentioned that it's not something that we can hear. It's too high of a frequency. Some bats, there's some sounds that we can understand and hear, but those sounds are going to be more of like a social call, maybe some sounds that a pup's making for the mom, and things like that. It's not going to be their actual echolocation that we're hearing. But something that we can do is use some different equipment to help basically turn that echolocation into something that we can hear. And that's what you see here over on the right. That is going to be a graph of a bat actually calling. And we do have some audio of that call, because what it does is it picks up that frequency, and that's what you're seeing over there on the left-hand side, or the y-axis, is going to be the frequency in the kilohertz. And you really want to look at that minimum frequency along with the shape of the pulse. So you note it's kind of like a small check or a small kind of dash, if you will. Those help our scientists and researchers figure out exactly what bat species they're looking at. And so if we cross our fingers here, I'll be able to play exactly what a bat's echolocation would sound like if we could hear it. Perfect. So that sound, you might have hopefully picked up that there were a few spots where it started to speed up a little bit. Those speeding up moments are when that bat is going to be picking up on an object like food and going a little bit closer. That's why we call it a feeding buzz. Later in the presentation, Sarah's going to talk to us about how our researchers and scientists use this to help. But what I do as a naturalist, and just because I love bats, I was able to purchase this very small device through Wildlife Acoustics. And this, what it is a very small piece right here that plugs into your smartphone, and you download a free app onto that, and you're actually able to pick up, just like this shows on here, the different sounds of a bat. Now, it's not as accurate as some of the equipment that our Division of Wildlife uses, but it does do its best to give what they believe that bat to be. So I've used this in many programs. I've gone on hikes with my family before, and just sometimes by myself when I'm out kind of at dusk and I'm curious what's flying up above. So let me go ahead and move on, because yes, these bats, as they emerge from hibernation in the springtime, are looking for food, but they're also looking for a specific area to land. Oh, just for those who didn't get to hear it, we'll do it one more time. Okay, now let me see. Let's talk about bat boxes. Bat boxes, a lot of misconceptions actually with bat boxes, because a lot of people will get plans for what's known as a single chamber, or I've heard them called bachelor pad boxes, and those just don't really work for a lot of bats. And those, as I think back to my childhood, were kind of the ones that were thought to be put up a little bit more. And that's just not the case. You really want to look at the design of your bat box and the location of where you're putting up that bat box to how useful it's going to be to the bat, because bats can be pretty particular about where they live, and we want to make sure we want to give them the best possible location for them. So the different types of boxes you can have are a range of different shapes and sizes, but the thing that really carries, even if it's a rocket box like the one here over on the left, or this large chambered box here in the middle, what you're going to notice is all those different areas that the bats can be in. Those chambers, as I mentioned, allow the bat to, if it gets too warm, move into a cooler area, or if it's on the inside chamber and it needs to get warmer, it can go to one of those outside chambers. They're very temperature sensitive animals, and so you really want to be conscientious about that. With your bat boxes, a lot of people think we should put them on trees because bats like trees. Well, they do, but unfortunately, if you put a bat box on a tree, it's not going to get the proper sunlight that it needs. You often think about a bat box needing at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, natural sunlight. And so the best kind of way we try to get people to do it is to put them on standalone poles and things like that, as seen in these pictures right here. So you're going to have them on a pole, and you also want them to be high enough off the ground. So you want to have it about maybe 15 feet or above off the ground, allowing the bats an area to swoop up and get inside. The other thing you want to do, and it's shown really well here on the left, is some predator guard. That is something that stops some of our unwanted raccoons and things like that from getting up above. The other kind of unwanted guests are insects like wasps and bees that might want to make a hive up in our bat boxes. And that's where it comes to the size that really matters of those chambers. So not only how many chambers you have in there, we usually like to say 4 or more, but the actual distance between them. So you're usually going to want to keep that distance around an inch, maybe even less. Anything larger than that allows time for other insects and things to get in there. So the other thing, not only do you want it to be standalone pole, 15 feet up off the ground, nice natural sunlight, you're going to want it to be in the right location. So you're not going to want it right into the trees or into the woods for obvious reasons that were already mentioned. They need that sunlight. So usually an open area very close to the forest though. You still want them to be in an area where there's going to be their food source. And if you want to put a bat box up at your house, make your land more inviting. We'll talk a little bit further if you have like a large property later on, but right now if you had in your backyard you wanted to put a bat box up, go ahead and plant some things around there that might be inviting to bats. Now we don't have any, flower pollinating bats here in Ohio, but we do have insect eaters and we do have great pollinating insects here in Ohio. So those flowers and things that you want to plant are going to be a little bit different than a pollinator garden in the fact that you want them to be flowers that are going to bloom later in the day. So a little bit closer to when our bats are going to be out. Oftentimes those flowers are going to be more whites and light colors as well. Some things in that nice, we call it like a moon garden or night garden, that you don't want to do is light. A lot of people think that spotlights are helpful because you can see the insects in the spotlight. That's just not the case. That can actually be kind of inhibit bats from doing their job. And so if you do need to have a light though, go ahead and make it on a direct location, whether that's a pathway that you're trying to light up or something like that. Don't have it just out into the air. Might make it a little bit easier for our bats and things. But whenever you think about bat boxes, think about your design, think about your location, and think about how you want those bats to be invited in. Now, if you're worried about if your box that you have or a box that you want to make is not the right design, we'll give you some really great resources here at the end of our presentation to kind of point you in the right direction. But what Sarah's going to talk to you about next is exactly what are they doing in these bat boxes and why are they so important to them.
Yeah, so a lot of people want to put up bat boxes in the winter to give bats a place to hibernate. But as we mentioned earlier, and I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat about temperature. So the reason a lot of bats go to caves in the winter is because the temperature is stable. It's actually around 50 to 55 degrees inside caves. So they're typically not going to stay in trees because it's too cold. Regarding houses, not really sure about that. We don't typically see it, but I'm not going to say it never happens. But anyway, the bat house is really going to be used in the summer to raise the pups because bat pups develop much more quickly when the temperatures are really high. So Catherine, if you can just go ahead and switch the slide for me there. Thank you. Just want you guys to be able to see these photos of the bat pups while I talk about them. So most species of bats only have about 1 to 2 pups a year. I believe these photos are both big brown bats. There is a species, the red bat, that can have up to 5, but in general, it's going to be 1 or 2 per female per year. And that's the reason that it's really difficult for bats to recover from large-scale die-offs like what's caused by white nose syndrome. So they just don't have a lot of young like something like a fish would have. So it takes a long time for them to recover from population losses. So bat pups are going to be born generally in June or July. When they're born, they're completely hairless, they're blind, their ears are folded over, so they're essentially deaf. But they are fairly large, so you can see in these photos that they're not really a lot smaller than the adults here. So what's really interesting and cool about this is bats move roosts a lot of times during the summer, and those pups can't fly, so the female bat, the mother, actually has to carry those pups from roost to roost. And you can see, looking at that size, that's a really incredible feat for her to be able to carry, 1, let alone 2 of those babies distances to a new roost. So the bat box provides a safe place for the maternity colonies, so all these females living together to raise their young in a safe, warm environment that will help them develop. Let's see. So one thing that's important to note, as I mentioned, that the bats are flightless when they're born, and they're not going to be capable of flight until probably the end of July or early August. So if you have bats in your house during the summer, we do have a restricted period between the middle of May and the end of July, where if you want to do an exclusion, you actually have to request a permit from the Division of Wildlife. And the reason that we do that is to protect these flightless pups. So if you do an exclusion in the middle of the summer and you exclude all the adult bats from that house, these pups are essentially just going to die because they cannot survive on their own and they can't fly. So that's why we have that restricted period. For the same reason, we also have a restricted period on tree cutting. So you're not destroying these maternity colonies with these helpless and flightless pups. Catherine, if you can switch the slide. Okay, so since most of the bats are most active in the summer, this is when we're able to conduct a lot of different studies on them. So I'm just going to talk about a few ways that we at the division study bats and also other researchers as well. Next slide, thank you. So Catherine mentioned earlier echolocation, and she played that bat call for you and showed you the picture of it. So this is one of the devices that we use to actually record the echolocation calls of bats. This is what we call an acoustic monitoring device. The one specifically in this picture on the right is called an anabat, but there are other devices. So how this works is that there's a microphone attached to the end. You can see that sort of black thing sticking off the end there. On top is a PDA where you can see the calls coming in, but the microphone only records ultrasonic noise. So when Catherine was showing you that the sonogram of the bat call, they call it a frequency that's in the ultrasonic frequency. So we can't hear that, but these microphones can pick it up. It won't pick up you or I talking, but it will pick up the bat calling. So you can do this in a couple different ways. We can do active monitoring. So like one of those things that Catherine mentioned that plugs into your cell phone or your tablet, this anabat here, you can essentially just walk around and record the bats as they're calling. And that's called an active survey. We can do a passive survey where there's different devices that you can actually set out in the field, and they can stay for weeks, months if you go out and change the batteries and memory cards. That gives us more detailed information on an area, how the bat activity is changing over the season. So that's a passive survey. And one of the ways that we've been studying bats for the last 10 years is actually with a mobile survey. So we use these anabat devices, but we take that microphone off, and then in the picture on the left, you can see it's actually attached to a mount on somebody's car roof. So we've been using volunteers for the last 10 years across the state And they take these devices, they pop those microphones on top of their cars, and they drive routes that we've established around the state of Ohio. And we've been able to monitor the relative abundance of bats in different parts of the state for the last 10 years. So we have some data on that. I'm not going to present it in this program, but we're hoping to produce a 10-year report after we analyze the data this year, and that will be available to everybody. Catherine, next slide. So the great thing about acoustics is that it's fairly easy. It's not very labor intensive. You can go out and put one of those things in the field and again, leave it for a week and not come back to it. But it doesn't give you a lot of data. You can tell generally what species you have there. You can't get a number with acoustics. You don't know if it's one bat that's calling 5 times or 5 bats calling 1 time. So if you want to get more detailed information, the best thing to do is to do what's called a mist net survey. And they also use these for birds as well, so you may have seen these if you've been to some bird presentations. But essentially a mist net is just a very thin nylon net, and you stretch it between 2 poles. You can see the photo in the upper left. Looks kind of like just a big volleyball or a badminton net. Generally what you're going to want to do, this photo is not the best place of where you would set one up, because you really want to set it up in a corridor where the bats have no choice but to fly right into it. So stretch it across a river, you stretch it across a trail where there's trees all the way around, and then the only thing they can do is fly right into that net. So you can see in the bottom picture there a bat that's kind of fallen into one of those pockets and gets tangled, and then the researchers can come over and remove the bat. And Catherine, if you want to play the video. So this is a video here that hopefully we'll play for you of somebody removing a bat. So there's a bat stuck in a mist net. First thing I want to point out is you should never ever touch a bat with your bare hand. So this person is a bat researcher, so they are vaccinated against rabies, but that's not something that you would ever want to do. And now we are also concerned about white nose, so we always wear gloves and change the gloves between bats when we're handling them. So basically you want to grasp the bat with one hand, and then you can just start peeling that net away. Generally it's best to take the feet out first, and then you start on the wings. Once they get this wing free, the researcher here, she's going to tuck that into her hand. A lot of times they're going to be, kind of flailing, struggling a little bit to get away from you. So you want to tuck that wing back in so that they can't get themselves stuck in the net again. And then once you kind of are down to one wing, it's usually pretty easy to peel that net off. This is kind of cool here because she's going to open the wing a little bit, and you can see the structure there. And you can see that thumb on the top of the wing also. So then once you have the bat free, this is great because you can collect a lot of data on it now. So you can take it back to a processing station. You can, of course, record the species. You can then record the sex, the reproductive status. You can measure the forearm and the wing and the ears, which are some of those characteristics that we use to identify them. If you want to take any sort of sample, a saliva sample or something from the bat, then you now have the bat in hand to do that, which obviously you can't do with acoustics. So it's a little more time intensive, but you get a lot more information from the bats when you do this. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. So one of the other things that we can do when we're mist netting bats is we can radio track them. So if we catch any of those species that are listed as state endangered or federally endangered, we're actually required to put a transmitter on the females. So the picture on the left here is a bat with a transmitter attached to its back. So the way we do this is you shave a little spot on the back, and then we use a non-toxic, non-permanent glue to attach this transmitter. The transmitter will last for about 3 to 10 days before it either falls off the bat, or sometimes if they're living in a maternity colony, the other bats will groom that transmitter off the bat. So it really depends on the activity, how long it's going to last. But using that transmitter and an antenna and a receiver, we can actually track those females back to their maternity colonies. So that way we can get some information about what types of areas they're using to roost, so we know how to better manage our habitat, protect those areas, and protect those certain types of trees. We can also protect that roost during the summer to make sure it doesn't get cut down or destroyed, and again, protect those flightless pups that are going to be inside that maternity colony. Next slide. Did you switch the slide, Catherine? I can't see it.
It did.
Okay, all right. Well, it's still on radio tracking for me, but next is Hibernacula surveys. So most of the stuff that that I just talked about is going to be done in the summer. There we go, now I can see it. But we also do the surveys in the winter where we go into the Hibernacula to survey the bats. This is a great opportunity because they are, again, relatively inactive, so we can go inside those caves, and get counts of the number of bats and the species that are in there. The nice thing about bats is that they're going to go back to the same places year after year. So if we keep repeating these surveys every year, we can get an idea of how those populations are changing. Are they surviving through the summer? Are they growing? You know, has white nose come in and wiped them all out? So we'll generally start these surveys at the beginning of December and do them through about March. So just to give you an idea what these photos are here, the one in the middle, that's a group of big brown bats that are hibernating together. I think there's probably 5 to 7 in that cluster there. In the middle is a tricolored bat, and then on the end is a little brown bat. And just something to note about the tricolored bat in the middle there, so it's not unusual for bats to be a little bit active in the winter. If you see one that's out flying around on a warm winter day, you know, sometimes last year when it's 60 degrees, we'd see bats flying around inside the caves. And it's not unusual, they will wake up and be a little bit active, but the tricolored bat is the one that is going to be the most inactive, the most still during hibernation. So they actually form this condensation on their fur because they're just not moving. So when you go inside a cave and you shine your flashlight around, you can see these little sparkling bats all over the ceiling, and you know those are tricolored bats. So it's really kind of a cool thing to see. Next. Okay, so just to wrap things up here, we just got a couple minutes left. We're going to talk about some ways that you can help bats and some opportunities to get involved in bat research and some more education opportunities. Next slide. Thank you. So Catherine already mentioned some things that you can do in regards to putting up a bat house and then kind of doing a moon garden. And those are great things if you have smaller properties. Even if you have larger properties, you can do that around your house. But if you have areas where you have a lot of trees, then you can do even more to support natural bat habitat. So bats really love, it doesn't necessarily have to be a certain species of tree, but any tree that has this peeling or exfoliating bark, if it's coming off kind of in pieces that they can get behind. So bats are not like rodents or like birds where they can create their own cavities. Their jaws are not powerful enough to do that. So they have to rely on natural cavities or cavities that other animals have created. So these places like this photo on the left here, these kind of shingles of bark, they can get behind those during the summer and live there. So those are the perfect types of trees that you want to preserve on your property. They really like dead trees, so large dead trees. If you can leave those and they're not a hazard, those are the things that you want to be keeping as natural roosts on your property. If you do have to cut down trees for some reason, it's best to wait. Our date that we give is October 1st. So after October 1st, the bats will be moving to their winter areas. They should be out of those types of trees, and you should be safe to cut them down. Just a note about if you have a bat that gets in your house. So if you just got one bat that flies in, the best thing to do is to shut off all the lights, open a window or a door, and then close off all the other doors. So basically only give it one way to get out, give it some time, should be able to get out on its own. If it doesn't, then we recommend using the shoebox method, or you just take a shoebox or a Tupperware container and put that over top the bat, slide a piece of cardboard or paper behind that, and then release the bat outside. I did notice in the chat somebody had asked about releasing bats in the winter. If it's a warm winter day, that's going to be fine. If it is cold out, it's probably best to call a wildlife rehab center, see if they can take that bat over winter, because it might not survive if you release it in the cold. If you've got a colony of bats in your house, best thing we recommend to do, you can do an exclusion yourself, but it's also good to call a licensed nuisance professional to help you get that bat colony out safely and legally. And the last two things here, as Catherine mentioned, all of our bats in Ohio are insectivores. So you want to try to be as pesticide-free and insecticide-free as possible. So bats are eating tons and tons of insects. If you're treating your plants and that gets on the insects, those toxins can build up in the bats over time if you're using a lot of them, and it can be detrimental to them. So if you have to use pesticides or insecticides, just make sure you're using them in a targeted manner, using them as they're described and where they should be used. And then the last one here, this cave closed sign, is to practice responsible recreation. So if you're on a trail and it ends in a cave that's not gated, it's still open, but there's a sign that says cave closed. Stay out of those caves. It's to protect the bats. We don't want you going in there spreading the fungal spores that cause white nose. You can get them on your shoes, you can get them on your clothes, and if you go into another cave, you can spread it to an area that may not already have it. If you are a recreational caver or a rock climber, then it's good to properly decontaminate your gear after each site that you go to. So if you're climbing somewhere in Ohio or northern Ohio, and then you want to go to southern Ohio, decontaminate your gear. Don't take your gear to a place that doesn't have white nose. So if you're again, climbing or caving in Ohio, and then you're going to go out west to one of the states where white nose hasn't made it yet, either decontaminate the heck out of your gear or just buy all new gear, just to make sure you're not transplanting those spores to a new area. So those are some of the ways, in addition to what Catherine already mentioned, that you can help promote healthy bat habitats and healthy bat populations in your area.
So, thank you, Sarah. What we want to conclude with today is how you yourself can get involved with these bats. So, the very first thing I like to tell people, especially it's great timing right now for us since we're asking to keep our distance and maybe even stay inside, educate yourself. There are so many great resources out there to help kind of give you the information you're looking for. But make sure you're going to an accredited site. Some sites that I really recommend is this Bat Conservation International. This is the site that I was going to point out for during our Bat Houses talk. If you're looking to make a bat box, this is the spot to go. They have a downloadable handbook that you can look at. It tells you exactly which way it should face, how tall it should be, everything like that. So Bat International, not only for bat boxes, but also tells you just so much more. A lot of educational resources for instructors as well. If you're looking to incorporate some bat information into your school lessons or your troop lessons, anything like that, I really recommend this website. This is a new thing that I learned about, is a bat working group. Ohio has a wonderful bat working group that promotes everything bat. So there's a lot of good links on there as well to help kind of teach us about one, what Bat Week is, and then everything that goes along with that. So things that Sarah and I may have mentioned today that you want to learn further on, they've got great educational videos for you to watch about those things. So that is a link to their Facebook page. It is something that I really think you guys should check out. We also have our batweek.org, which right now is buzzing. There is so much stuff on there, from coloring pages to an awesome cookbook, all sorts of things on that Bat Week. And then really important, and Sarah just mentioned it with the closed caves, or if you are a cave or a rock climber, this whitenosesyndrome.org. It does have a decontamination protocol on there that I really recommend you follow and kind of look into before you go out, so you know what exactly to do after you're done recreating. These are just a few online educational sources. Go local libraries have great websites as well. I know our library here in Oxford has gone ahead and thrown in a drive-through window, so during this time they can just hand out their already decontaminated books. There are so many good resources out there to help you educate yourself and get you ready to get involved physically in some community science projects. So the one thing that I absolutely love is this Bat Roost monitoring project. So what that's going to be is, it's usually about 2 times per year. You're going to go out, if you have a bat box on your property, and just sit and watch. Who doesn't love watching bats? You just count how many bats are actually using this roost area. And then that information gets sent in, and it really does a good service to our community. The other thing is going to be the Summer Mobile Acoustics Survey, which Sarah mentioned is where they put the microphones on top of the car and you drive around in a specific route, specific location, time, everything like that. That is actually something that naturalist Sean and I down here at Houston Woods participate in, and I can tell you there is nothing cooler than on a summer night holding that acoustics equipment and just watching the bats come in. We physically can't see the bats all the time, but we can hear them, and hearing a bat was something previously we never could do. So this kind of the partnership with the Division of Wildlife, and Sarah in particular, has really been something we kind of treasure a little bit. It has opened our eyes to some new things. So really, if you want to take part in that, you can email Sarah there. And then last but not least, do your part. If you've got the property and the ability to do so, put up a bat house. Make your backyard just more bat friendly. If you can't have a bat house, just make it an inviting area for bats to come in and get a meal, get a drink, you know, have a stop for a second and take a break. The other thing, and kind of what I will conclude with, is you got to sit and listen to Sarah and I talk today. Go tell people what you learned. Tell people it's Bat Week. share with them these websites, share with them some of the kind of fun facts that you learned today, because that then helps other people appreciate and understand that our bats are something that are in need of our help and something that we can help. So there's always something that we can do. And I know Sarah and I really appreciate your time, and we would love to hear from you. Are there any questions you guys have for us?
Are there questions, Catherine? We have tons of questions.
Great, I love questions.
Yes, so I'm going to start with some from, we have Mr. Kern's class that is with us today. So thank you for joining us. Let's see, they have quite a few questions. They ask, are caves safe for bats? Do the rocks ever fall? And if they do, can bats get away quickly? Are you there, Catherine?
Oh, I am. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Sarah, if you want to weigh in here a little bit, since you actually have gotten to do some of the studies, but take it away, Sarah.
Yeah, so I imagine that, I'm not going to say never happens. I imagine there have been an unfortunate bat that might have been squished by some falling rocks, but in general, it's going to be a very safe place for them. A lot of the bats inside the cave are going to be tucked up like inside a crevice. They're not always going to be just hanging and exposed or on loose rocks or things like that. So they're actually going to be in relatively protected areas inside some of the caves.
Okay, and how many bats does a group need to be called a colony? So I guess what's the size of a colony?
Yeah, I saw that question and I was pondering that. I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule of a certain size. I would say that it's probably going to be at least 5 females together would be considered a colony.
Okay, and there's a lot of good questions, so sorry, I'm going to be flying through these. How does the wing work to make the bat fly? Do they close their fingers to fly?
Yes, they don't necessarily close their fingers. Bats actually fly in kind of like a rowing motion. So if you think about going like this with their wings, so they're going to fly by rowing essentially, and they do move their fingers. I wouldn't say they close them like this, but they can move them around. So bats are really, really agile flyers. So if you've ever had a bat flying towards you to get an insect and you think it's going to run right into you, and at the last second it'll kind of turn away. They're extremely agile, which they do by moving their fingers around.
Okay, and just to clarify, so we don't want the public to ever proactively go touch a bat that's hibernating in a cave, right? So
yeah, so even when we do our Hibernacula surveys, we do not touch the bats for the most part. There are certain research projects that we might do, such as swabbing them to see if they have white nose, but even when we go in, we are very quiet. We take care not to disturb the bats to wake them up, because again, they're on very razor thin margins of how much energy they have stored, and if we wake them up numerous times by touching them or bothering them, they might not make it through the winter. So yeah, you should definitely never touch a bat anyway, especially don't disturb them in the winter.
Okay, and Adam had asked, what are the best trees to plant for helping bats have sleeping areas? Sorry if I read that awkwardly.
Yeah, so it depends on the species. So we have some species of bats that live in that that loose bark, like I mentioned, and that can really be any tree if it's dead, or any tree can kind of have that type. We recommend shagbark hickory a lot for Indiana bats and little brown bats, but there are other species like the tricolored bat that actually roosts in the leaves of trees. So it's really more about having preserving trees that have cracks and crevices and that shaggy bark, and anything that's kind of a large diameter.
Oh,
I'm sorry. There's been quite a few questions that have come in about vampire bats, and if they suck your blood, and are they here in Ohio? What do they eat? So could you touch on vampire bats?
Yeah, Catherine touched on this a little bit, so if you want to say anything after, I'm done. But yeah, they're not here in Ohio. There's only a couple of species, I think generally in South America. It's sort of a semantics here, but they don't actually suck blood. What they'll do is they'll use their teeth to pierce the skin of a mammal, like a cow or something, and then they'll lap up the blood. So I know that doesn't make much of a difference, but it's important just to kind of be correct here that they're lapping up blood. And they generally won't do this to humans. It's generally going to be things like livestock and cows, things like that.
Okay, and we had a couple people that asked if bats can swim.
Yeah, they can. They're not especially strong swimmers. They're not really going to choose to go swimming. But there have been times when we've been netting and one's, happened to fall in the water for netting over a river or something, and they can swim to shore. Generally, once they get to shore, they're going to have to climb up on a tree or something to be able to start flying again. But they can swim, but probably not for long periods of time.
Okay, and what's the furthest that a bat will migrate, and how long does it take them to get there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I was frantically trying to Google that when Catherine was speaking, because we don't know, honestly, a lot about bat migration. So it's definitely an area where we need to do a lot more research, and I'm hoping that we can do that. We've got some students at OSU that are studying that now. But something like a silver-haired bat, I found one study, I believe it's just a simulation, but it said something like 1,500 kilometers, which is about 900 miles. So a lot of these bats will, especially silver-haired, they'll kind of just pass through Ohio. They spend their winters or their summers in Canada, and then they'll migrate into the southern United States for the winter. So that's incredibly long distances for at least that one bat.
Okay, and let's see. I had a couple questions come in about will male bats fight for territory? Sorry.
Yeah, so generally the females are going to form colonies, and the male bats are pretty solitary during the summer, so they don't live in those same big colonies like the females do. And I don't know probably the exact answer to this question, but I imagine that they do have some sort of territories. I don't know that they necessarily defend them in the same way that other animals do, but I know that there is some aggression between the males sometimes. Again, they have like you said, they have a mouth. They can definitely bite. I don't know that it's common that they're going and attacking each other and sort of doing these fighting displays that a lot of other larger mammals do.
Okay, and we know that there's over 1,400 different species of bats in the world, but do you know how big the bat population is? Not just the species.
I don't in particular, Catherine. I don't know I know that there's just in Texas alone, there's a large colony of free-tailed bats in one of their bridges that I believe is like 1.5 million bats that just live in that one spot. They've also got Bracken Cave down there that also has millions of bats, so it's got to be quite large.
So lots of bats. Okay, and do fruit bats hibernate?
So fruit bats are generally going to be in areas that are warmer, so they're more tropical species. So as far as I know, they are not hibernators. There's probably an exception to that. There's always an exception, but for the most part, I'm going to say no.
And I thought this was an interesting question. Do bats have belly buttons?
Yeah, they actually do. So they're a mammal, so they were inside the mother's womb, so they have that umbilical cord, and so they will have a belly button. I don't know that I've ever seen it, but they should have one. I'll look next time.
Do all bats live in colonies, or are some more solitary? Lauren had answered in the chat, and she said the eastern red bat is one of our solitary bats, but many species are more social. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, again, there's always going to be, you can't really say that one characteristic is true of all bats. So yeah, we definitely, and again, even within a species of bat, a lot of times the males are solitary in the summer, and then the females are going to form those colonies. But yeah, the tricolored bats generally, and probably any of those migratory tree species like the red bat and the silver-haired bat, they're going to be more solitary than some of the other ones.
Okay, and so we had Lori who asked, can you find out about volunteer opportunities? I know Catherine shared some links at the end there to participate in. Lori was asking about participating in the acoustic surveys as an OCVN, Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist. So I just didn't know if you had anything to elaborate there, Sarah.
Yeah. So I'm actually giving a presentation next week to the OCVNs, so there'll probably be some more information there. But that roost monitoring, I don't think now that we have the new website, I'm not sure that information's made it to the new ODNR website, but it is on the Ohio Bat Working Group website. You can go to the Get Involved tab there, and you can actually download the packet that explains how to do it. It has all the data sheets in it. It has my contact information for the roost monitoring. For the acoustics surveys, the mobile ones, we're actually getting ready to redo that entire program. So we've done 10 years of a certain protocol. There's a new protocol now that's being implemented nationwide, and we're going to join that. So in the next year, next summer, maybe the summer after that, we're going to have tons of opportunities for people that are interested in helping with that. So I think Catherine had my email up. So if you're interested in that, just feel free to send me an email, and I'll put you on a list to start contacting when we start redoing that program.
Okay. And I just want to say for the people, because we are going over an hour, I'm going to continue asking some questions because there's still a lot of people on here. But for those that have to leave, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. It's been fun having you. And I'm going to get back to a few questions now. Let's see. So when bats migrate, do they return to the same area that they were housing in?
Yes, in general, it's called site fidelity. So bats have high site fidelity, which means that they're going to return to the same, not only the same place in the winter, but also the same place in the summer. So that's what we always recommend. If you have bats in your house one summer and you don't do anything to solve the problem over the winter, they are going to come back, and there are probably going to be more of them. So if you have bats in your house, it's a problem that you do need to address, or it's just going to get worse or better, in my opinion. But but yeah, they're always generally going to go back to the same areas.
And why do bats sleep during the day?
So most of the insectivorous bats that are here in Ohio, all of them, I guess, they eat nocturnal insects. So they're adapted to eat a lot of things like moths and beetles. One thing that I guess Catherine and I didn't mention, or at least I don't think we did, is the agricultural benefit of bats. So they're eating a lot of crop pests, a lot of, again, things like moths and beetles that would normally be destroying crops. So they save agricultural industry. I think it's like $3.5 billion every year in the United States. And most of those things are going to be nocturnal insects. So that's why they're more active at night. Again, some of those fruit-eating bats in other areas, they're not nocturnal because they don't need to be out at night to eat fruit. It's actually better for them to be out during the day. So not all bats are nocturnal.
Okay, and this is an interesting question. Have you ever had, it's a good question, I'm now wondering, have you ever had a bat get in your hair while you're out doing surveys?
Yes, with an asterisk by that. Say yes, because it is, it's a common myth that bats are going to fly into your hair. It generally doesn't happen. If they're swooping around near you, it's because you've got insects near you and they're just trying to capture those. But there was an incident where we were mist netting and I had bent down to tie my shoe, and we were releasing a bat. So somebody was holding it. You basically just hold it out on your hand. It drops down. Well, it dropped down right onto my hair. So, it didn't mean to. It wasn't actively trying to fly at me, but it did get into my hair, which was kind of funny.
Blaine asked, do bats use their hyoid bone to make the sounds they use in, oh gosh, I don't even know, echolocation?
Yes. I saw that one too, and I'm definitely not an expert in the system of echolocation, but I Googled it really quickly, Blaine, and it said that it's something called a stylohyal, which is part of the hyoid bone structure, and they do use that. I can't tell you any more than that because that was all I had time to read. But, I think the answer is yes.
And Jana asks, do bats live in leaf litter or just hide?
There can be, actually, the red bat, there's evidence that it can hibernate in leaf litter. So generally during the summer, it's going to live in the actual leaves of the tree, not on the forest floor. But there is some evidence that they may spend the winters hibernating in leaf litter. I don't believe we've seen that in Ohio, but there is some evidence in the literature has been documented in some other areas.
Okay, just a couple more questions, and then you're out of the hot seat, Sarah. Do bats, you kind of touched on this when we talked about, males fighting for territory, but somebody did ask, do bats, do they fight or do they live peacefully in a colony? So I guess that's a little bit more general than just, territory.
Yeah, so it's, I imagine it's a little bit of both. So even in these large colonies, there's always going to be some sort of aggression, and bats actually have really highly developed social systems and communication. So they've got distress calls, they've got aggression calls, they've got anger calls, and friendly calls, and all this stuff. So I imagine that they might be in colonies and also fighting a little bit, but again, not necessarily this violent, like fighting to the death. And vampire bats are actually really interesting because they're one of the few animals that display altruistic behavior. So they live in colonies, and if there's times when some of the bats are not able to feed, some of the other vampire bats will actually regurgitate some of the blood that they've eaten and feed it to the other bats that weren't able to find meals. So they actually have very sophisticated social systems within bats.
Okay, and somebody asked, will this presentation be available online to review? Yes, it will. All of our webinars are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. So if you go to OhioDNR on YouTube, you'll be able to find this sometime next week. But how fast can bats fly? Somebody else asked.
It's generally, I want to say around, I think it's like 9 to 10 miles per hour for the fastest. When we do the acoustic surveys with the cars, we try to stay at around 15 miles an hour when we're driving. So it's not too fast that you're picking up all that road noise, but it's fast enough that you're not having one bat that's just flying over top of you the entire time, because it's faster than they can actually fly. So I'd say somewhere around 9 to 10 miles per hour.
Okay. And can bats eat apples?
I would imagine that fruit bats could, although I'm not sure there's a lot of apples in the areas where the fruit bats are. But bats in Ohio are definitely not going to be, any bats in the United States are not going to be eating fruit. But in the areas where there's fruit bats, I imagine they could.
Okay. And last question, it's a great question. Are there any animals that prey on bats?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons Catherine had mentioned when we were talking about bat boxes. You don't want to put bat boxes on a tree. There's things that, like domestic cats, raccoons, things like that can get up into those bat boxes. Birds of prey, so owls, hawks, and things like that will prey on bats as well. I don't know about here, but I used to live in Puerto Rico. There was a cave there where these boas would hang down at the entrance of the cave, and they would just capture bats as they flew out of the cave. So there's definitely snakes in some areas that will prey on bats.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah, so much. Thank you, Catherine, both of you, for your awesome presentations. We are going to wrap it up, and thanks to our viewers for sticking with us, even though we went over time. Your questions are fabulous. I do want to just let you know that on Friday of this week, we are going to have a Sasquatch special webinar. So it will be Friday at 10. You can find information on how to join on our Facebook page. So go to OhioDNR. You'll find the information there. And then next month, we're going to have a series with our wildlife officers. So stay tuned for more information on that. Have a good one.